What if a sleepy honeycomb could write the rules of a whole planet? Mira Hunt had never imagined that a tiny creature would change the biggest market on Earth. Instead of a cure for cancer or a new energy source, a handful of wingless bees had locked the secret to a perfectly balanced world inside their dance. Mira lived in the valley of Dorin, a quiet town where the wind smelled of pine and the river sang as it ran past greenhouses. She was a neuro-entomologist, a scientist who listened to the thoughts of insects. Each day she pulled a telescope out of the closet and peered at the swarming black flowers that only the rare Lumen corbicularis could pollinate. These bees were weird. They swam in the air like leaves on a thatched roof, and they flapped at a soft frequency that Mira could feel in the bones of her ears. Nobody had ever encoded the whispers of their dance. Mira worked for the university, shuffling papers and offending her boss with her early breakfast. She had a small room and a pot of simmering broth, a garden that no one else could see because the windows were dusty. Her life was ordinary, and she often wondered if she could ever break out. She dreamed of trading markets, of letting wealth grow from a simple idea, but profit felt far away. Another layer like the polished leaves on the top of the onion she grew at dusk. One autumn morning a crimson envelope floated into her field, snagged by a drifting leaf. It held a sketch of a bee with trembling fingers. Mira read the rough note inside, scrawled as if a hand cried. It said, "She turns honey into balance, into quote." Listen, what is that? The words made her heart beat fast. What if there was a way to earn money without working? What if a hive's dance held a map to a new world? She took the sketch, made a copy of it on the back of a weight, and set it against the winds. The next day she built a tiny device that could measure vibration frequencies that most turned down as noise. The beads inside glittered like starlight. She fixed it by a window next to the bobbing teapot. That night she rested. The next morning the bees sang differently. Mira listened attentively. The drone again responded, then paused and finally passed through a curtain of fur. She saw lines, spirals, a schedule that moved the bees' fire through the field like a river. In that breath, she realized that this was no mere animal behavior. It was a spreadsheet. It was a map of resource flow. Plants grew exactly where the nectar needed to float, pests vanished, soil stayed healthy. The more Mira recorded, the more she saw the bees dance as equations, as a code that let nature divide its gifts without waste. The chart she made on the back of the sketch seemed to write itself: cooperate, share, never hoard, each bee pulls from the same pot for the same period, never starve, never overgrow. She knew something big was hidden. She called her cousin Milo, who ran a small farm in the valley. Milo had heard rumors that the government might be interested in the bees. He laughed and said, "You are going to turn the farm into the world's first money machine." Mira's answer was simple: what is money without balance? When Milo showed her his farm, Mira decided to test the code on a crop. She made a small field, part of a sheep's grazing ground, and patched it with a single seed of the Lumen flower. The bees arrived in a flock, flapped their wings, and in minutes a network of tiny networks formed. The ring around the plant seemed to glow like a string of fairy lights. As days turned, the peaches grew to a size that the whole valley could share. In halting signals, the bees balanced their energy, and the plants the field grew no greener or harsher than needed. The fruit was plentiful, but the crops never lost a flavor or the earth did not crust. Mira felt like a child finding a new toy. The morning sun turned the valley into a gold test bed for her theory. The bees had made a network so efficient that the farm lost the old waste of surplus fruits and no more overwatering was needed. The vines grew to a height that the bowing hedges would pass through, and the bees carved out a path for wind flow that kept the soil cool. She could see a world beyond the valley. All that needed to do was respect the pattern written in the dance. Word of Mira's experiments leaked beyond her garden. Among the rumors was one about a group called the Apex Predator Fund, a hedge fund that did not trade in stocks, but in the rhythm of the earth. This fund used ecological data to lift markets up, predicting a flurry of paper trail inside the gold reports of commodity firms. They hired a boy from the desert to intercept them. They called their drones mechanical pigeons, with sharp spines that darted in the air. After a month of testing, they were ready to act. When the first drone flew over Mira's valley in the dark, the little instrument slid from the trellis and skimmed the roof of the hive. It glared at the bees as if it saw its own reflection. The drones were smaller than others, but they were heavy with computers. They broadcast a signal that told the bees to abandon their dance and focus on the ground like a swarm of ants. The bees had not been told what to do, but Mira saw the fire misunderstanding. The bees grew restless, leaving the crops of Milo's farm and going into a frenzy. The drone's mechanical spines landed inside the hive and whispered a code that triggered a small rupture in the animals' nerves, leaving them inert. Mira ran to the animals. The bees' wings were still and very still. The hive was quiet. She tasted the rising rot in the ground, a sharp sting that seemed to taste like failure. Panic shuddered in her chest. She did not have power to fight, but glowed with a quiet fury. She filed a rule that the foundation of a market was no easy route to solve nature's missing half. The apex predator fund lied off the valley, presenting their uncovering as a science story. They sent Elena, a woman whose eyes were cold as a river rock, into the valley as a liaison with a reporter. Helena cut a line through the forest. "We need the data," she said. "We want the code so we can bend the market in our favor." Mira stared at the dark horizon. Her core conflict, the one that had driven her to the valley, echoed in her alone. If I unknot this balance, can I future the world, or do I tear its fragile heart? Now, as the drones came with more weight and fire, Mira had to decide. She had two options: stand in the capacity to build a garden of scale, or hold back and promise that this balance belonged to nature alone. She pressed her fingers into the rough, dark fabric of the bee's hive. The hearts beneath her felt the thine, a rhythm at the pace of soil and soil only. The path forward twisted and twisted. If she latched onto the market, she would bring the birds from the seas and tether them to the rising mountains. If she stayed hidden, she would keep society from the wild. She chose a third road, trusting the bees are little, but they were computing big things. She would confide only in Milo. Mira slipped into an old shadow at midday and whispered to Milo. He looked at her with the forced calm a knight does before a battle. The next morning they smashed a secret code into a message, but instead of the bees' appropriation, they decided to disrupt the drone. The code was a splice from the bees themselves. The mechanical spines fell into a trickle of empathy, latching on to the unity that meant nature's inherent balance. The drones could not affront the entire colony because they came in conflict on the way they mixed. They tried to issue the signal, but the bees remembered the algorithm. They clashed and pinned the drones to the flies. They used their weed from a network that internals like a spider. Across the valley, the apex predator fund had a crisis in its own feeds. They cut the alliance to bypass each other and found the capital was unstable. No one could produce more markets. It seemed the knowledge was wearing the system. The next morning the sun rose over the valley like a guardian. The bees hovered over Milo's silver apples and spread their wings. The world had answered the Airbnb. The market itself was blank because the funds were broken and the giant companies had alienated on a pathway that made losing the package that lead to grapes. Now the valley was a quiet place where all pounds of flowers recruit mold every day, and the equity was the age of wheat, a true story of a planet that had once belonged to a hive. People learned to pay for their harvest with the scent of blossoms. The alien moved, but no longer with the bees. Instead, they came together with quiet wonders of historic life. Mira smiled as she looked at the bees. They had offered her a lesson. In their simple hop and whirl, they had set the earth's rhythm. She thought of how a market could that step change into looking too bright, turning brief, "be careful." She could have saved her own life of growth because she decided to protect nature, to keep the bees preserved. Her voice was low. Maybe the only way to change the world is to keep it simple. Mira watched a tiny light glow in a dust sample of the westerly wind and felt the pulse of the planet spread. The world had changed in a chaos in the outsiders, how a story with all its arguments could be a role thrown. The lesson was a simple reminder of a question that had started as a whisper. What if a small organism can dictate the fate of the world? In her hands, the answer was that the world's rhythm was rooted in die letters and right.
Found this interesting? Subscribe to the channel. Give this video a like, share it out, and drop your questions or ideas in the comments. Until our next adventure.